Traditional psychological assumptions of an economic theory used to be: the agent of economic theory is rational, selfish, and his tastes do not change. It is clear that this is not what people are really like. The behavioral economist Richard Thaler used the terms econs, which use System 2, and humans, which use System 1, to help economists and psychologists work across their boundaries of study. Expected utility theory is a logic of choice based on elementary rules, or axioms, of rationality. It was adopted by economists as a logic that prescribes how decisions should be made and as a description of how econs make choices. Mathematicians used to assume that gambles are assessed by their expected value, a weighted average of the possible outcomes, which each outcome is weighted by its probability. A Swiss scientist named Daniel Bernoulli applied the relationship between psychological value or desirability of money, also known as utility, and the actual amount of money. Bernoulli concluded that utility is a logarithmic function of wealth. The psychological response to a change of wealth is inversely proportional to the initial amount of wealth. For example, a gift of $10 has some utility to someone who already has $100 as a gift of $20 to someone who has a current wealth of $200. Bernoulli found that most people dislike risk, the change of receiving the lowest possible outcome, and if offered a choice between a gamble and an amount equal to its expected value, they will pick the sure thing. People's choices are generally not based, not on a dollar value, but on psychological values of outcomes, their utilities. Bernoulli's theory assumes the utility of wealth is what makes people more or less happy. There is an error in his ways, though. As psychology shows, experience of happiness is determined by recent change in wealth, relative to the different states of wealth that define the reference point. Therefore, you need to know the reference before you can predict the utility of an amount of wealth. This theory was accepted and used for so long because of theory-induced blindness, which is the idea that once you have accepted a theory and used it as a tool to think, it is difficult to notice its flaws. This explains why Bernoulli's theory stuck around so long. Amos and Kahneman noticed those errors and developed prospect theory. Prospect theory takes into account this reference point, while expected utility theory does not. They decided to work on people's attitudes to risky options to answer this question. What rules govern people's choices between simple gambles and between gambles and sure things? However, the consequences of choices are never certain. For example, when purchasing a big item, there is no telling what you might be able to sell that item for later on. Prospect theory explains how and why losses are more painful than gains, and this explains decision-making in a more comprehensive way than expected utility theory. Losses are felt more extremely than gains because people do not like to lose. Bernoulli's theory is too simple and lacks a moving part. The missing variable is a reference point, the earlier state relative to which gains and losses are evaluated. Utilities are attached to changes of wealth rather than states of wealth. Prospect theory defines outcomes as gains and losses, not as states of wealth. When it comes to gaining, we tend to take the sure thing, and when it comes to losing, we tend to take the gamble. There are three cognitive features at the heart of prospect theory that can be seen as operating characteristics of System 1. Evaluation is relative to a neutral reference point, an adaptation level. For financial outcomes, reference point is usually the status quo. It can also be the outcome you expect or feel entitled to, which means anything better than the reference point is a gain, while anything below this reference point is a loss. A principle of diminishing sensitivity applies to both sensory dimensions and the evaluation of changes of wealth. A weak light in a dark room has a large effect, while the same light in a bright room has little or no effect. Losses feel larger than gains, which is the principle of loss aversion. This asymmetry between the power of positive and negative expectations or experiences has an evolutionary history for treating threats as more urgent than opportunities and gives an organism a better chance to survive and reproduce. Losses feel larger than gains, which is the principle of loss aversion. This asymmetry between the power of positive and negative expectations or experience has an evolutionary history for treating threats as more urgent than opportunities and give an organism a better chance to survive and reproduce. The fundamental ideas of prospect theory are that reference points exist and that losses loom larger than corresponding gains. For a rational agent, the buying price is relevant. The fundamental ideas of prospect theory are that reference points exist and that losses loom larger than corresponding gains. For a rational agent, the buying price is irrelevant history. The current market value is all that matters. Kahneman used an example of a study conducted by John List at a baseball card convention. List found that novice traders were reluctant to part with cards they owned, while experienced traders were willing to trade, thus showing that the experienced trader had a larger effect on the endowment theory. To further test the point of endowment theory, List engaged traders in a survey where they would The fundamental ideas of prospect theory are that reference points exist and that losses loom larger than corresponding gains. For a rational agent, the buying price is irrelevant history. The current market value is all that matters. Kahneman used an example of a study conducted by John List at a baseball card convention. List found that novice traders were reluctant to part with cards they owned, while experienced traders were more willing to trade, thus showing that the experienced trader had a larger effect on the endowment theory. To further test the point of endowment theory, List engaged traders in a survey where they would be presented with a gift for their participation. At the end of their participation, the participants were given the option to exchange their gift for the other gift that was offered. The inexperienced traders exchanged only 18% of the time, while the experienced trader traded 48% of the time. Veteran traders have apparently learned to ask the correct question, which is, how much do I want to have that mug compared with other things I could have instead? People who are poor think like traders. The problem is that all their choices are between losses. Money that is spent on one good is the loss of another that could have been purchased instead. For the poor, costs are losses. The fundamental ideas of prospect theory are that the reference point exists and that losses loom larger than corresponding gains. For a rational agent, the buying price is irrelevant history. The current market value is all that matters. Kahneman used an example of a study conducted by John List at a baseball card convention. List found that novice traders were reluctant to part with cards they owned, while experienced traders were willing to trade, thus showing that the experienced trader had a larger effect on the endowment theory. To further test the point of endowment theory, List engaged traders in a survey where they would be presented with a gift for their participation. At the end of their participation, the participants were given the option to exchange their gift for the other gift that was offered. The inexperienced traders exchanged only 18% of the time, while the experienced trader traded 48% of the time. Veteran traders have apparently learned to ask the correct question, which is, how much do I want to have that mug compared with the other things I could have instead? People who are poor think like traders. The problem is that all their choices are between losses. Money that is spent on one good is the loss of another that it could have been purchased instead. For the poor, costs are losses.
The brains of humans and other animals contain a mechanism which is designed to give priority to bad news. Emotionally moving words quickly attract attention, such as war and crime, faster than do happy words, such as peace and love. Paul Rosen stated negative trumps the positive in many ways, and loss aversion is one of the many manifestations of a broad negative dominance. Loss aversion refers to the relative strength of two motives. We are driven more strongly to avoid losses than to achieve gains. A study conducted at the University of Pennsylvania presents a perfect example. A reference point, par. For a professional golfer, a birdie, one stroke under par, is a gain, and a bogey, one stroke over par, is a loss. These fierce competitors certainly do not make a conscious decision to slack off on birdie putts, but their intense aversion to a bogey apparently contributes to extra concentration on the task at hand. Loss aversion creates an asymmetry that makes agreements difficult to reach. The concessions you make to me are my gains, but they are your losses. They cause you much more pain, and they gave me pleasure. Inevitably, you place a higher value on them than I do. Many of the messages that negotiators exchange in the course of bargaining are attempts to communicate a reference point and provide an anchor to the other side. Because negotiators are influenced by norms of reciprocity, a concession that is presented as painful calls for an equally painful and perhaps equally inauthentic concession from the other side. Loss aversion is a powerful conservative force that favors minimal changes from the status quo in the lives of both institutions and individuals. The important task for students of economic fairness is not to identify ideal behavior, but to find the line that separates acceptable conduct from actions that invite punishment. Employers who violate rules of fairness are punished by reduced productivity, and merchants who follow unfair pricing policies can expect lower sales. Unfairly imposing losses on people can be risky if the victims are in a position to retaliate. It appears that maintaining the social order and rules of fairness in this fashion is its own reward. If people who lose suffer more than people who merely fail to gain, they may also deserve more protection from the law.